We can do this? Okay. Good morning, Temple Emanuel. Hello, and welcome to, I have to change I don't like the view that I'm looking at. I'm sorry. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. And welcome to our session this morning with Donnie Siegel, who I remember taught you last summer, if not in between. So I know that you all know each other. And today he's going to be teaching a Torah of possibility, leadership, and social change. In case for those of you who missed the last 2 days, and if you did, I hope you'll watch the recordings. I just want to thank you, Temple Emanuel, again for being a presenting sponsor for our week of learning and for our incredible partnership with Rabbi Wes Gardenswartz and Amy Klein, who is also a board member of the Institute. And I have to say, as I was thinking about, a chief inspirer and motivator of our entire team. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And over the last few days, it's actually, I wish we were in person, but I appreciate seeing faces and names in other sessions and feeling like we're getting a sense of each other, so that when we do meet in person, perhaps when I'm up in Boston for work, when I'm visiting my daughter at Tufts, it'll be like, we'll be friends already and we'll have a place to begin and continue our work together. As I hope you all know or are learning, the Shalom Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank, an educational center for the Jewish people based in North America and in Israel. And if you're looking for additional learning, check out our podcast, For Heaven's Sake, and Identity Crisis. I think they're both great. And you can look at our journal sources. I'm going to be facilitating this session with my colleague, Ariel Meiri. If you have technical issues, you should chat Ariel, not me, because I will then chat Ariel. And if you have questions about any of the programming or the Institute, I'm actually going to stick my email in the chat at some point today, so you have that. And then we can continue to get to know each other. A few questions before Donnie starts teaching. We need to end for sure on time, which we've been doing, but we need to do that today. If you, as we've been doing, text me questions during the session, and then when Donnie breaks for questions towards the end, we'll be able to get to those, as many as we can. A recording, as you know, will be made available within the next 48 hours, although we aim for sooner than that. The sources are going to be in the chat, and you can find out more about Donnie by reading the bio at the bottom of the session page. And honestly, I love Donnie's bio, so you should definitely do that. And now I'm going to hand it over to Donnie.
Oh, thank you very much. It's much a pleasure to be here. And we've met a few times on Zoom already. So I see all these faces in the crowd that I feel very close to. And hopefully we'll be able to do this in person sometime soon. Be'ezrat Hashem. So I'm going to get to the sources in a second, and to that title, Torah of Possibility, which actually isn't even my title. I was just talking to a friend and told her what I want to teach. And she gave those words. And ever since she gave those words, I said, that's what I believe Torah is. Torah is a Torah of possibility. And in 4 words, she put a lot of what I believe in into a short sentence. So I just want to say something about the time and place. This is a very, very interesting journey that we're going through. Our world is going through very interesting things. We have a new government in Israel, very interesting times. And I can say personally that both my 18-year-olds just graduated high school, 2 18-year-old girls, and they're going on a journey of their own. So it's very exciting and interesting times. And I want to talk about one more journey, which has a lot to do with the journeys that I just talked about now. That's why I began that way. I love the book of Bamidbar, which is the book we're reading now, which in English we call Numbers, which is a very good name for the book because it explains a lot of what happens in the book of Bamidbar. The people of Israel are counted twice, or actually 3 times. The number is always the same number. It's around 600,000. 603,550 to be exact, if I remember. The tragedy of the book of Bamidbar is that the number is the exact same number, but the people are not the same people. They count the people of Israel once in the beginning of the book, and they count them again in the end. And the similarity of the number shows how tragic the other component is, that the whole nation is turned over because these 40 years of punishment of walking in the desert were basically part of what God said, that nobody of the people leaving Egypt will enter into the land of Israel. And we had to have the whole nation overturned to enter into Israel. But the journey I wanted to talk about is the final journey. At the end of these 40 years, they start walking towards the land of Israel, and they take a very interesting route. They're down in the Negev, if you have the map before your eyes. So they're down near Beersheba in the south. And all you need to do to walk into Israel is just go straight up north and you're in the country. Instead of doing that, they go around to the east and they take a very big loop and they go all around the Dead Sea. Then they come north of the Dead Sea where they can't enter because there's a Jordan River. They didn't think of that. And then they have to split the river and walk into the promised land, which I think is very interesting in many ways. I think sometimes we need to know we're going through something. Just as we had to cross an ocean to leave Egypt and to realize that something happened and we're putting something behind us, we need to cross a river when we walk into the land of Israel. And Joshua needs to do the same things as Moses and etc. But again, the journey, if you think, when they do that big loop around to the east, they meet very interesting people or nations. They go through Edom and Ammon and Moab. And basically, they're visiting, or before they enter the promised land, they're visiting everybody else they could have been. It's all family members. Edom is Esav, and Ammon and Moab are the descendants of Lot, Abraham's kind of nephew. And even Balak and Bilam, the prophet that came last week to curse the people of Israel, even he's a family member in many ways. He comes from Aram Naharaim, the same city where Abraham grew up. Seems to be a very, very special person with a lot of power in his blessings and in his curses. I like to think they grew up together, by the way, Abraham and Bilam. I think they were in the same class. They went to Hogwarts. Hogwarts in Aram Naharaim. I'm sure Abraham was Gryffindor, and Bilam was probably Slytherin. But when I say they went to the same class, I think they were probably the two best magicians in the class. And they were the top of the class, the two best students. Bilam, by the way, when the sages, when Chachamim refer to Bilam, they say he was bigger a prophet than Moshe Rabbeinu. When we sing in the end of the tefillah, Lo kam be'Yisrael ke Moshe od, there was never a prophet in Israel like Moses. So they'll say the other nations we had. And who was that? That was Bilam. We have somebody with amazing powers. I'm sorry. Did you follow? Because my connection was up. Do you follow now? Can you hear me? Yeah? I'm sorry, I lost it for a second. I was using my phone to be on the safe side, but then somebody called. So I apologize. Maybe I'll move over to the regular link. Okay, I hope this doesn't happen again. I'm not that popular, so not many people will call me. Bilam, who grows up with Abraham, and he's the best magician in the class. I can imagine the discussion they had one day. Abraham comes to Bilam and says, hey, God revealed himself to me and said, I should go to Canaan and I'll have a nation of my own. And Bilam says, what? Forget it. We can just stay here. We're having a good time. And Abraham leaves and Bilam stays. I'm saying this because Yehuda Amichai, that you all know that I love dearly, the Hebrew poet, he has a very nice wordplay on Bilam. He calls him Bilam Bli Am. Bli Am in Hebrew is nationless, with no nation. And basically he's saying, how did Bilam become such a great prophet? They were both great students. Abraham took on a mission. And now he had a lot of things to tend to. He had a wife and kids and a nation to lead and congregants and people to visit and people to chat with during Kiddush. and all these things. And all that time, Bilam was just becoming a good prophet. So even when Bilam comes to curse the people of Israel, this is in Yehuda Michai's poem, he looks upon the nation and he realizes what he gained and what he lost. He's this great prophet with no nation, and when he stands and he says, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, how great are your dwellings, O Israel, there's something, but all I'm trying to point out is even Bilam is a family member. So we're going through, I would call it all of the roads not taken. That's what we're doing. Before we enter our own promised land, we're asked by God to confront everything we chose not to be, all of our other futures. And it's a nice way to look about how do we enter our promised land. We say yes to something, and we need to realize also what we're not. And after not fighting with these people, because we had no wars with them, because they're our family, we don't fight with them. But after confronting them or facing them, then we're willing to enter our own promised land. So that's a very interesting journey that we're walking through the book of Bamidbar. And I want to point that out because I'm going to say one more thing now about the journey. So Ariel, thank you, was kind enough to put the sources in the chat. You can open them, but I'll also be sharing them on the screen. So if you just want to watch the screen, that's fine. And I'm going to go through the sources now. So we're starting here. One second. We'll move us aside so we can see. The Torah of Possibility, Leadership, and Societal Change. So I'm going to be speaking about all three of these one by one. Possibility, leadership, and our ability to change. I'm going to start with leadership and then move on to possibility and our ability to change. So I'm continuing with the book of Bamidbar. One of the interesting things that happens to the people has to do with leadership, because while we're visiting all these other futures, all our other paths that we chose not to walk through, we also lose all our leaders. And whoever came to hear Amy have an aliyah for her birthday in Parashat Chukat last week, so in Parashat, that was actually Balak. 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, we lost all of our leaders. In one parsha, we lose Miriam, Vatamot Miriam. We lose Aharon. And we also realize that we're going to lose Moshe. He doesn't actually die till the end of the book of Dvarim, because he still has a role in the book. But he sins by hitting the stone and not talking to it. And the Torah already says that he's not going to enter the land of Israel. And I want to share a very nice interpretation of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Alav Shalom, about losing our leaders and about the sin. What was such a grave sin of Moshe that he receives this punishment of not entering into the land? Don't know if any of you heard Micha gave kind of a half shiur, half eulogy for Rabbi Jonathan Sachs around the Shloshim, and basically said that if you look at a lot of his books and his Torah, he in many ways answered one question: why remain Jewish? And because it was a question that I think a lot of the people following Rabbi Jonathan Sachs were asking themselves. And he also framed it, Micha, by saying that if you live in the liberal Western world and you live a full Jewish life, then some of your values might be contradicting. And Jonathan Sachs was also asking, what do you do with if you have liberalism and equality? What do you do with your Jewish tradition when it meets your Western tradition? And Micha in his shiur said there's two answers that Rabbi Sachs gives. One is a good answer, and he called the other the great answer. But one is saying what he says in a lot of his books. I remember I followed them as they were put out, and I was a pretty keen reader. So one is saying anything that you have in the liberal Western values you can find within Judaism. So equality stems from Torah, and freedom stems from Torah, and liberalism stems from Torah. And anything that you can find out there and that you like so much, we have this at home. If you look at home, it's there. That was what he called the good answer. But the great answer, and I think what becomes very interesting in the Torah of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, is when he seeks to say, not only can you find it here, but like if you read to heal or to mend a fractured world, don't know how it's called in English, or to repair a fractured world, letaken olam shavu, it was called in Hebrew. So he tries to say something more, that he thinks there's a lot of things wrong with the world. Not only can we find in Judaism what we can find out there, but a lot of things within our tradition can mend things that are out there, can repair them, can give us another point of view, which is very important. I'm saying this about Rabbi Sachs's Torah because I'm going to get back to it when I want to talk about what a Torah of possibility means. And now I just want to look for a second at what he said about leadership. So I'm reading a bit of the opening. It is one of the great mysteries of the Torah. Arriving at Kadesh, the people find themselves without water. They complain to Moses and Aaron. The two leaders go to the tent of meeting, and there they are told by God to take the staff and speak to the rock, and water will emerge. Moses' subsequent behavior is extraordinary. He takes the staff. He and Aaron gather the people. Then Moses says, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raises his hand, raised his arm, and struck the rock twice with his staff, and that cost Aaron and Moses their chance of leading the people across the Jordan into the promised land. This is the story we all know. What was the sin? Rabbi Sachs asks, and he gives two very interesting answers. It's written here, but I'll say it in my own words. One is, he says, Moses didn't realize something which is very important to leaders, that the people have changed. He's been there for 40 years, but it's not the same people. And if you think of it, like poor Moses, what happens? I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just explain this. I love seeing faces. What happens to Moses? 40 years earlier, he takes the people out of Egypt. There's no water. They complain. So he takes the staff, he hits the stone, water comes out of the stone, and everybody's happy. It's an amazing miracle. 40 years later, he finds himself in the same actual condition. Everybody's upset. There's no water. He takes the staff. He's like moving through the motions. He doesn't even think. He hits the stone, and suddenly it's a grave sin. You can even say that the verse in Hebrew says, Shim'una Hamorim. What we translated as, listen, you rebels. He calls them Hamorim. It's one word in the Tanakh. It doesn't appear anywhere else. Nobody knows what Hamorim is. So this translator chose to say it's rebels because the word meri comes from mered and rebellion. But you can hear from Morim, the place where Moses hit the stone in the first place was called Mara. That's what he has in mind. When he says Shimuna Morim, he says, oh, you're the same people from Mara. So what happens when the people have changed, and as a leader, you haven't understood that. There's a beautiful shiur from a rabbi in Israel called Yoni Grossman. He points out that Moses wasn't even listening. If you had listened closely, you would have seen they're not complaining about the same stuff. When they left Egypt, their complaint was, let's go back to Egypt. Now they're saying, let's already go into Israel. Why aren't we there yet? But he's not even listening. He just hears the same complaint. Well, we have 6 kids, Baruch Hashem, and a friend of mine told me that you have your first child, you think you've learned everything. And then when number 2 comes along, you say, wait, I've done the whole course, now I know what to do. And you really have studied. The problem is it's a different child. And you're taking your classes or all your lessons from child number 1 and trying to apply it to somebody totally different. And the same thing happens with child number 3. And every time you think you've learned your lesson. So Moshe's first thing about leadership is he doesn't realize that the people have changed. The second thing that Rabbi Sachs points out, and I love, is that he says this is the first time Moshe has to deal with something when Miriam is not there with him. She just passed away in the beginning of the parasha. By the way, if you look again closely at the words, when Moshe says, Shim'una Hamorim, listen, you rebels, the letters of Morim are the same letters of Miriam. And you can see, according to this interpretation, what's on his mind. He's saying, listen, this is my sister. She's been looking after me literally since I was born. When I was put into that thing and sent into the Yeol, she was there to guard over me. I've never had to deal with anything without her. So the first time Moshe is without Miriam, there's a beautiful, there's a Reform rabbi called Ofek Meir. He lives in Haifa. And I read a passage this morning. This morning here was many hours ago. So I read a passage this morning by Ofek Meir. He says, and he has this picture that the stone that Moshe was hitting was the tombstone of Miriam. And it's like a beautiful picture of realizing the anguish. It was the stone that somebody put over her grave. And but it's not only that Moshe misses Miriam. There's so many midrashim that say that we didn't have one leader. We had three leaders. That's what the book of Micha says that we just read in the Haftorah this week. Vaishlach lefanecha et Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. I sent in front of you Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. When you have three leaders, they balance each other out. They all know what to do. They know this one's going to pull this way, the other one will make it okay, and this one will go talk to the person who's been offended by the first one. But when Moshe loses Miriam and Aaron, he loses his balance. So I just want to put out the two or three things we've said about leadership. Moshe is a leader, and he loses it when he doesn't realize that things have changed, that we need to treat things differently, and we need to approach things differently, that the people aren't saying what we're used to them saying. They've grown up, they're different things are on their mind. The second thing is about leadership, I would say being balanced. You have to realize who the people are around you. What you have to say on one hand to balance out the other leaders, to balance out what the community is feeling, to balance out what other people are saying. You need to hold some, how do you say, izun? I say like to balance out something. When something's going one way, you need to be there to give weight on the other side. And when Moshe loses his balance, this is what happens. So that's two short things I wanted to say about leadership. I want to say something short about possibility, and then maybe to get to Torah of possibility and to change. And if you have any questions, please send them to Jenny, and we'll break in the end after this second part also. I'm going to go back to the source sheet for a second and continue with possibility. So I'm skipping Echad Ha'am for a second, priest and prophet, and moving on to Leviticus. And we're going to shortly read through a few verses and through a nice midrash, a nice take by the sages on these verses. The verses are what happens when a woman gives birth. And it's about the rules of purity and impurity when a woman gives birth. I know that these terms are difficult to think of with something so pure like giving birth, and also applied to a male or to a female. But I want to give a general idea about this. So the verses say the following. The Lord spoke to Moses, I'm in source number 3, saying, speak to the Israelite people thus, when a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean, which is not a good term, for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, verse number 3, there's already the Brit Milah. And for 33 days, even though there's still not what we would call blood purification, then there's still different rules that she can do or not do. And the rules are different for male and for female. And there's certain days that which we would call days of purity and certain days of impurity. Without going into all the details, I'm gonna try and give one or two takes about what it means. I always think that the words tuma and tahara, which we translate into purity and impurity, can't be translated. They just come from a different language. And we can maybe talk about consequences of tuma and tahara, which is what I'm gonna try and do in a second. What bothered me in these verses is if there's anything pure and holy in this world, it's a moment of birth. And I could never understand how you can relate impurity or something that has to do with the word tum'ah with the giving of birth, be it male or female. How can birth do anything with tum'ah? And I want to try and approach that question with a short idea from source number 4 from Midrash Rabbah, and I'll skip straight to the English. Remember, Midrash, this is somebody getting up in shul 1,500 years ago, probably in some synagogue in the north of Israel, reading these verses about a woman giving birth, looking at his congregants, and asking himself or herself, if somebody gave the Dvar Torah, if it was a woman at the time, so asking himself or herself, what do they want to hear? I'm going to talk, the parsha talks about birth. What can I talk to my congregants about? And he chooses, wherever they are, they choose to speak about a verse taken from the book of Psalms. The verse in Hebrew says, Achor v'kedem tzartani v'tashet alai kapecha. In English, it's over here, it says, thou have formed me from behind and from before or from in front. And then you laid your hand upon me. And I'll explain it not in Shakespeare English. Basically, the verse in Psalms is saying, when you created me, there was like a front and back, which the person speaking went on to say is you created me with opposites. Every person is created when we contain opposites. And then, Vatashet alai kapecha, you lay your hand upon me, you chose one of those things. So if you read through the Midrash, then the first one will say that Rabbi Shmuel will say when he created man, he created him male and female together. Be it somebody who has male and female genitals, or be it back to back, or like the Zohar will say, or Plato will say, or neither this or this, but the first they'll say male or female. Then they'll say when the first man was created, he was created good and bad, a real tzaddik, and also with the ability to be very evil. And the third one will say, they'll put it in the realm of space. That when Adam Arishon, when the first man was created, he filled the whole world from north to south, or from east to west, or from the ground to the sky. And the last one will say it in the realm of time, that when the first man was created, he was born here, but he could see till the end of all generations. In many words, what is this Midrash saying? That when the first human being was born, he was born full of potential. Basically, he could be anything. The first thing which was created in the world before creation was possibility. All the possibilities were there open. It could be anything. And what's interesting about that, I think parents, look at the verses again. Ishaki tazriya ve'yalda zachar. When a woman at childbirth, then it says bears a male. But let's stop before those words. What happens when you're pregnant and you're walking around in the world? So it depends if you're in Israel or if you're not in Israel. If you're in Israel, people will lay their hand on your stomach, right? Because it belongs to everybody. If you're in more civilized places, then they'll just say, oh, Mazal Tov or B'Shah Tovah. Sometimes they'll ask, oh, what do you have? נכון? And you'll say, I don't know, maybe it's a puppy, maybe it's a male or female, maybe it's twins. We don't always know, right? I never liked that question. And I always said, wait, you'll find out. I like mystery. I don't know if you know this, but the alligators, their eggs are not male or female. Did you know this about alligators? Their males are amini, asexual, and it depends on the temperature. So in the summer, there's boy alligators, and in the winter, there's girl alligators. And in the zoo, they decide if they want a boy alligator or a girl alligator, and they heat the temperature in the to the right temperature for what they want. Basically, the idea of possibility is that everything can happen. And think before ultrasound in Hebrew, which I think is ultrasound also in English. So we parents would sit there looking at the pregnant stomach and saying, "Manyan, like it's interesting. What are we gonna have? What's she gonna be? Is she gonna be president? Is he gonna be a teacher? Is he gonna be a piano player? Is she gonna play basketball? What are they gonna do?" And you think they can be anything. What happens when they're born? There's something wonderful. But the thing is, they're only one of all the things we thought they could be. And all the other possibilities are not there anymore. Purity and impurity, there's a classic linkage to life and death. I don't really like that because I think death is also, it, it's, a, it's problematic to link to anything. But to link impurity to the loss of possibility, that I can understand. What was pure in the world? The fact that anything could happen. And when we, out of the million options, we choose one, which might be amazing, but it's only one, and we let go of 999,999, that's a moment where we've lost something. That's Ishaki Tazriya ve'yalda ve'tam'a. She gives birth, and then we lose. By the way, only the kids lose that, because as parents, we keep seeing everything in the child that we thought they could be. I'm sure when my parents look at me, they still think that I might do this and I might do that. And I know that's how we look at our kids. We don't lose that, which is it's wonderful that there's at least one or two people in the world looking at you and believing that you can be anything. It's a very important gaze to have upon ourselves in life. But I want to put those two things now together, leadership and possibility. I'll do this quickly so we can open up to questions. The two other sources that I put on the sheet, and I already see that I'm not gonna be able to approach the Talmudic sources. Just means we have to meet again. But Echad Ha'am says the following here. I'll share screen again. And Echad Ha'am is a very popular piece of Echad Ha'am. And if you haven't read it, I'm sure it's translated somewhere. I couldn't find the full one. It's called Priest and Prophet. It's about leadership. And he says the following. He says that everything in the world is balanced. He starts with physics or metaphysics, and then with mechanics. And he'll say how, like in the world, all the stars and planets, they orbit and they're all pulling each other. They're all pulling in their own direction. And the fact that the world doesn't collapse is just because we're balancing each other out at exactly the same way. And then he'll talk about how nations balance each other out. And in the world of ideas, how different ideas keep each other. Everyone in itself might destroy the world, but we balance each other out. And then he goes to leadership, and he speaks about priest and prophet. And the prophet will be the one that knows the truth. I'll go to the English here, I apologize. So here, the prophet will say, a certain moral idea fills the prophet's whole being. It engrosses his attention. He knows everything. This is, by the way, Moses. And we'll get to Aaron in a second. The prophet speaks on behalf of God. So he's never willing to compromise. He knows what needs to be, and that's the direction he pushes the world. And we have different prophets pulling in different directions. The priest, in his words also, Aaron HaKohen, Moshe's brother, Ohev Shalom Verodef Shalom, the one who pursues peace all the time. So the priest desires to perpetuate, takes a wider view of the relation between the idea, the facts of life, not what ought to be, what can be, is what he seeks. The priest lives amongst different prophets. His role is to listen to all the prophets and to create a way of life that um, doesn't bring to destruction, that takes reality into account and says what can be and not what ought to be, just like the prophet does. Now take this priest and prophet, and I want to read one more thing about prophet. Here, there's a link here to priest and prophet. I see it now. I apologize. Should have looked it up. And I want to read one passage from the Ishbitzer Rebbe, Mea Shiloach, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner. Very known for his very outgoing or extreme views on many different things. And you have the English here. I'll explain the idea because of the time. I'm not going to read through. What does the Ishbitzer say? He says that Kohanim, remember the priests, they're not allowed to be exposed to anything that has to do with death. If somebody dies in their family, they're not supposed to be in their room. They're not supposed to go to the funeral, or they stand far away. They don't go to cemeteries. There's a special plot for Kohanim in the cemetery so they can come from the outside. And until today, many Kohanim, many priests follow these rulings. What's interesting is the explanation that the Ishbitzer Rebbe gives for why a Kohen can't be exposed to death. He says death isn't the problem. The problem with death is, remember Princess Bride, by the way? There's a great sentence there. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. So when you're all dead, as they say in the Princess Bride, there's no possibility for anything. Death is the end of possibility. What's pure about life and what is impure about death? Not life and death in themselves. Purity lies or lays in the grounds of possibility. And death says that there's no possibility to change anything anymore. Why shouldn't a priest be exposed? Because priests are the people that are supposed to carry for all of us the possibility of possibility. Somebody needs to remain optimistic. So if you have 2 or 3 rabbis in the community, if it's a smart community, what are you supposed to do? Take one of the rabbis and say, okay, you can't listen to the news. We don't want to expose you to the outside world. You just remain optimistic. You're the one who's supposed to enter the shul with a smile. Somebody in the congregation needs to carry the possibility of possibility. It's not just in the congregation, by the way. It's I think every family needs this, every group of people. When I was in the army, we had night guarding. You had to guard half an hour during the night. And we had one person in the unit who played guitar beautifully and sang very nicely. So we exempt him from guard duty every night, and he would just sit while we were all getting organized to go to sleep, play his guitar and sing for everybody. That was saying to somebody, you guard for us the possibility of something else. There's a world out there and we want to know there's a world out there, and we'll do the guard duty. Somebody has to smile. Somebody has to be out there. Somebody has to remain. And by exposing somebody to the lack of possibility, they might lose their ability to believe that things are still possible. So the priest, their role is to keep something possible. Now, I'll just say one more word and when I'll open up for questions. it's a very interesting role in my eyes for leadership, and I think it has many implications. If you look at leadership or carriers of Torah as those people who are supposed to carry the Torah of possibility, what does it say about their job or about their role? What's a rabbi supposed to do in times of Corona, which was a big question? What truth are you guarding? If you were a prophet, are you guarding everybody should come to shul? Are you guarding everybody should be safe? Are you guarding family? Are you guarding returning to life and the importance of meeting other people? What are we guarding? But if you're carrying a Torah of possibility, Tov, it has many implications about what your leadership looks like and what voice you bring to the table. So I'm just going to say for a second what we've done so far, and I will open up the questions. I started with our journey, with all the things that were once possible to us. Those were the things we didn't choose, but I think, by the way, we might have chosen something from each one of them. We didn't walk through Edom and Ammon and Moab and saying, no, this is just not what we're not. We're not that, but maybe we took something from this and we took something from this and we learned something from here. And we spoke about leadership and about Moshe and not realizing or not being open to the changes and not having the balance, which I came to now again with possibility, not having the balance between him and other leaders. Why is that related to possibility? But I think many times the role of a leader is to say that something else is always possible and to open up more options. Translating possibility into Hebrew is interesting. You can use the word efshar or ulai, could be, maybe, it's possible. Each one of those words carries something else. But I just wanted to raise the idea that I think the Ish B'Tziel says in a very, very strong way. The Echad Ha'am speaks about the balance. But I think the Ish B'Tziel is saying that it's not balance between leaders, it's that the leader is there to balance what's happening in the world. That's why you have to be a real close listener. What are people saying now? What are people going through? What do they realize is happening? What do they think is not possible? And maybe I'm there as a leader to hold the hope for what they at the moment think is not possible and to say that it's still a possibility. I'll stop for a second, and I'm very happy to hear remarks or questions or thoughts, and then maybe we'll go back for a second. Yeah, Jenny.
Okay. Thank you. A couple of things. So first of all, I'm going to note the provenance of one of the questions because lest anyone think that I am directly quoting Rabbi Sachs, I'd like them to know that it's actually Wes doing that. So Rabbi Sachs, and I'm going to combine two questions here. So Rabbi Sachs is a famous distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism is wishful thinking, the belief that things will just work out. Hope is action. Hope is a system of deeds we do to make a difference. So first, what is the difference between possibility and hope and optimism, which is a beautiful way of asking the question. That another way to ask it is, you talk about this, the clarity of this lens of possibility that our parents look at us, that we can look at our children with. What's the, and when do we, when does reality come into the mix of hope and possibility, or caution or accommodation? I'm not sure how else to flesh that out, but and so and then I could follow, and I could give you another one now, or I can let you go with that.
I'll go with that for a second.
Okay.
I have to remember and to remember in English.
It's very hard.
Things in my, I think in terms of hope, as opposed to said hope as opposed to optimism. Like if you translate in Hebrew, ifshar, I think is possible. That's just the possibility that something might happen. Like the word ulai, which we would maybe translate as maybe, it doesn't really mean that in Hebrew. Ulai is something that you hope for and you're working on. It's like wishful thinking. And ulai means when Yaakov goes in to trick his father, Isaac, who's blind, he says, Ulai yemusheni avi. Maybe he'll fail me. And Rashi says he was hoping that he would touch him and realize that it's not him. So he came in and maybe he played with his voice a bit so he would realize that it's not him. Or maybe he didn't, he already did something to make what he was hoping for come into reality. And Be'emet, it's two different things. And I read somebody yesterday, the Esh Kodesh, who was killed in the Holocaust. He speaks about the word ratzon, will, and he says, if you don't do anything to make your will come true, it's not a real ratzon. Ratzon is only something that you're willing to work for. And if you haven't done anything for it, it's not ratzon. So when I say carrying the possibility, I think it definitely embodies or involves doing something in the world to make it happen. But I want to say that even if things don't happen, and I'm getting to your second question of when does reality come in, the fact that parents look at their child and believe they can be anything, even though they're not going to be, I think it's still meaningful. I think it's meaningful to the child. I know that my Abba and Ima once thought I would be Rosh Memshala, President of Israel. I'm not, but it's a warm feeling. And every time I go and I meet them and they say something about this or about that, I can still hear that in their voice. So I'm not, I teach at Hartman, which is second best. Nachon? But even though I'm there, I feel, so I teach at Hartman as if I'm a Rosh Memshala. And if you want to be so she'll be a basketball player, but she'll have the gentleness of the piano player that they dreamed about. As I said, we don't give up those possibilities. And I think that glance doesn't have to do with reality in the sense that things have to be realized, have to go through a real realization. The fact that they're there make a very big difference. Mamash. I'll say one more word. It's almost, we're studying now Masechet Yoma for Yom Kippur. There was a person, not the high priest, the other one who took the goat out into the desert. And there were 9 stations from Jerusalem to the desert. Each station had food and drink, even though it's Yom Kippur, because the person is walking in the desert. The Mishnah says that he never drank or ate anything in any of the stations. So they ask, why was it there? Because they say, when you know it's there, you're not hungry. And I think there's something very true about that. You don't have to bring things into the realization. That look or glance or belief is very meaningful, even if it's not brought into realization.
Okay. I guess to follow up on that, there have been this is such, and for those of us who've learned with you before, you are such an optimistic person. You kind of exude that. So like holding that with what you're talking about today, and squaring with this moment of where we are in the world, right? And there have been a number of questions about how do we square this with tragedy and loss, and including, I think that's something that we're all paying a little bit of attention to, if not a lot. This, the collapse of the apartment building in Florida. The just sheer collapse. So, what does possibility look like in this?
It's a tough question. And I think there's situations where You don't walk into the room with a smile because reality doesn't make you smile at the moment. Um, and I also think what's interesting is that what I said about Kohanim isn't really true. Um, that they never really shut themselves off from the world, because that's not the kind of optimism we're really looking for. You don't want somebody who didn't listen to the news about what happened in Miami, so they walk around the room with a smile because they weren't watching the television or they didn't hear what happened. That's not a leader. The Kohanim dealt with all the sick and poor people, and all the people with tzarat, the lepers. The only people they met were the Kohanim. The Kohanim didn't shut themselves off from people suffering or from the fact that life isn't always fair, but they carried a very gentle balance between knowing that that's definitely part of the picture, but not allowing it to be all the picture. And there's a big dispute between Harry and Sally when Harry met Sally. At one of the parts when they've spent the night together, and then she gets upset with him because he doesn't give it enough. So she says to him, "You're acting as if it doesn't mean anything." And he says to her, "I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything. I'm just saying it doesn't have to mean everything." So I'm with Harry. And what I want to say is that the gentle balance, I like to quote our holy sources, the gentle balance between um, the Kohanim are very aware of everything that's going on in the world, and they're never willing to allow that to cover the whole picture. And I think that's very important because it gives room for pain and for suffering, and it doesn't paint a world which is untrue, um, but it always holds on to the fact that there's something else, that there's future, that there's more things. And I think that both those things are very important. And the Kohanim are supposed to carry both.
Okay, thank you. One thing I could say is that I think that your knowledge of pop culture and my knowledge of pop culture, it is extremely, extremely in sync. Um, so I don't have any other questions from my team on the screens. So I guess what I will just do is say thank you, see if you want to have a last word. And also too, I'm going to announce that tomorrow is going to be the last session of the week with your own Rabbi West Garden Swartz and Danielle Hartman. And so I'll see you back here tomorrow, but let me see if Donnie wants to close.
Just thank you very, very much, Mamash. Be'emet, it's sincerely a pleasure. It's so strange that we're so far away, but I always feel very much at home. So it's always very special to talk to this congregation. So thank you, Rabbi West, and thank you, Amy, and thank you, everybody, for being here. And Bezat Hashem, we'll see you in person sometime soon. Toda.